Hey guys, tonight we're climbing into one of history's most uncomfortable myths. The idea that knights just slept peacefully in their shiny metal pyjamas. You know, the armour-clad heroes of legend snoring proudly after a day of jousting, rescuing damsels, and dramatically removing helmets for slow-motion hair flips. But reality. Let's just say if you've ever fallen asleep on a camping trip with a rock under your back, you've already had a better night than most medieval knights. Before we start, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what ungodly hour it is for you. Somehow it's always 2:17 AM somewhere. Now dim those lights, grab a blanket, preferably one not made of chainmail, and let your eyelids get heavy as we drift back to a time when comfort was considered heresy. Because tonight, you're not just falling asleep, you're being knighted in the most miserable way possible. Congratulations, noble sleeper. It's the year 1372. You've just spent 12 hours clanking around on horseback, your armpits smell like boiled cabbage, and you're about to learn why sleeping like a knight is not the compliment it sounds like. Your bed is a patch of lumpy earth covered by a thin wool blanket that feels like it's been washed exactly once, in a puddle of disappointment. You remove your helmet, take a deep breath of fresh night air, and immediately regret it because your tent mate's feet are approximately one sword length away and smell like roasted despair. The ground is uneven, the blanket damp, and the air has that special medieval chill that seeps straight through your bones and into your soul. Beneath you, something moves. Possibly a rock, possibly a beetle plotting its own crusade. You shift, trying to find comfort, but the earth shifts back. It always wins. You tell yourself knights are supposed to be brave, strong and noble. But at that moment, bravery is defined as not crying while your lower back fuses to the ground. Outside the tent, horses snort in the dark, their warm breath rising like tiny ghosts of judgment. You envy them. They get straw. You meanwhile are lying on a medieval chiropractor's nightmare. Every time you try to roll over, your armour padding creaks like a dying door hinge, and your knee smacks into a helmet that isn't yours. You whisper an apology, hoping the owner isn't awake. He is. And now you're in that tense half-asleep moment where two men silently pretend not to exist. Sleep doesn't come easily when you're wrapped in 30 pounds of chainmail regret. The gambeson, that thick, quilted undershirt meant to soften the armour's bite, has turned into a medieval sauna suit. You sweat, then freeze, then sweat again. It's like being both overcooked and underdressed. You try removing a layer, but everything's laced shut with cords that require the finger dexterity of a harpist and the patience of a saint. And then there's the noise. Not the peaceful chirping of crickets or the soft rustle of wind. No, the night hums with the soothing soundtrack of humanity's worst bodily functions. Dozens of armoured men snoring through nasal passages narrowed by years of bad ale and battlefield dust. One of them wheezes rhythmically, like a blacksmith's bellows in distress. Another lets out what can only be described as an emotional fart. You wonder if this is what brotherhood smells like. Your pillow, if you can call it that, is a rolled-up cloak still damp from yesterday's rain, and it smells faintly of horse and iron. You turn it over, but the other side somehow smells worse. You close your eyes, willing your mind away from the discomfort, imagining the glory of battle, until you remember that glory usually ends with someone stabbing you in the armpit. Somewhere nearby, a squire sneezes and mutters a prayer. You'd pity him if you weren't busy envying his youth and unbroken spine. Every few minutes someone outside shifts the horses, and the jingling of reins sounds almost like lullaby bells, until a hoof kicks a shield and jolts the entire camp awake again. You try to meditate, counting sheep, but halfway through, you realise you probably ate one of those sheep earlier, so instead you count regrets. By number 27, you start to feel something approaching sleep, that fuzzy, blissful edge of oblivion, right before a drop of icy condensation from the tent roof plops directly onto your forehead. You lie there, eyes open, reconsidering every life choice that led you to this moment. That shining armour you wore all day. It weighs between 45 and 60 pounds. Taking it off requires at least one squire, 2 prayers, and a moment of quiet reflection on your life choices. Most knights simply didn't bother. They slept half-armoured, which is basically the medieval equivalent of napping in a car seat belt while someone slaps pots nearby. Now, You might imagine a knight heroically removing his gauntlets beside a roaring fire, armour glinting in the glow as his loyal squire prepares a goblet of wine. Reality? It's closer to a slapstick routine performed by two exhausted men and one uncooperative suit of metal. First, the knight tries to unbuckle a strap he can't reach. Then the squire tugs it from behind, only to accidentally punch his lord in the ribs. There's cursing, sweating, maybe some crying. Eventually, both give up, agreeing that sleeping like this is fine. Spoiler, it isn't. The armour doesn't rest gently on the body. It presses, it pins, it persists. The chest plate flattens your breathing until every inhale sounds like a small wheeze of surrender. The shoulder plates dig into your collarbone. The greaves, those long, metal shin guards, ensure your legs can't fully straighten or bend, leaving you stuck in the world's most uncomfortable yoga pose, the rusted pretzel. And let's talk about that padding beneath the armour, known as the gambeson. Imagine sleeping inside a quilt that's been soaked in sweat, stuffed with horsehair, and then sandwiched between two skillets. It's thick, itchy, and absorbs every scent of the day. Sweat, mud, blood, and a faint note of despair. Taking it off at night would mean exposing yourself to the cold and worse, to whatever biting insects are currently debating your flavour profile. So, knights kept it on. All of it. Turning over in armour wasn't a graceful process, it was a full-body event. First, you build momentum, a little rocking motion side to side. Then, with a heroic grunt, you heave yourself halfway over, only to stop mid-roll because the chainmail under your arm caught on your belt buckle. Now you're stuck, face down, gasping, wondering if this is how heroes die, suffocated by their own fashion choices. Even when you finally manage to lie still, the metal doesn't let you forget it's there. Every small movement comes with a symphony of creaks and clinks, like a blacksmith having a bad day. And if your squire is nearby, you'll hear him giggle quietly before pretending it was the wind. Now, the romantic poets of later centuries liked to describe knights as sleeping under the stars, their armour gleaming in the moonlight. They forgot to mention that the gleam was mostly from grease and sweat, and the sleep part lasted about 15 minutes before the knight woke up with a leg cramp powerful enough to make him question the entire feudal system. The irony of chivalry was that knights were supposed to embody grace, dignity, and poise, but after 12 hours in armour, they looked and smelled like a walking compost bin. The armour trapped everything: heat, moisture, and regret. A single night in it could leave skin rubbed raw, and muscles aching in ways even medieval medicine couldn't explain. Some chroniclers even joked that the true test of knighthood wasn't battle, but surviving the act of taking your armour off without collapsing. And yet, armour wasn't just protection, it was status. A gleaming suit meant wealth, honour, and craftsmanship. It said, "I am a man of valour." It also said, "Please help me scratch my back. I haven't felt it in 3 days." Removing it wasn't just inconvenient, it was an ordeal. Some suits had over 200 rivets and straps. If a knight fell asleep fully armoured, he risked waking up fused to his bedding like an overcooked grilled cheese. So most knights compromised. They'd shed their helmets and gauntlets, the easy bits, but keep the breastplate or chainmail on, muttering that it was just in case. In case of what? Midnight jousting? An ambush from a rival lord? More likely, it was in case they couldn't bear to go through the whole dressing process again come dawn. Because dressing a knight wasn't a quick grab-your-coat moment. It took 20 to 30 minutes, 3 deep breaths, and one squire muttering prayers to St. George. So if you think knights were noble warriors of discipline and valour, remember this: half of them went into battle not because they were brave, but because it was easier than taking their armour off and putting it back on again. Ever tried to nap in a hammock made of linked metal rings? Neither have I, because I like myself, but knights did. Chainmail dug into every possible surface, shoulders, ribs, and dignity, leaving you with the world's most medieval waffle pattern imprinted across your skin. Chainmail, despite its romantic reputation, was not designed for relaxation. It was engineered to stop swords, not support sleep. Each tiny ring, carefully interlocked with thousands of others, added up to about 25 pounds of metallic discomfort. When worn, it pressed down like an aggressive, clingy hug from a very heavy friend who smells faintly of iron and sweat. And when you tried to lie down in it, well, that's when the real tragedy began. First, There was the noise. Every movement, no matter how slight, produced a sound like someone emptying a bag of cutlery onto a stone floor. Shift your arm, clink. Scratch your nose, clink, clink. Try to roll over quietly so you don't wake your tent mates. Congratulations, you just started a midnight percussion concert. Imagine trying to sleep while sounding like an entire kitchen collapsing around you. Then there was the pressure. The rings of chainmail didn't distribute weight evenly. They focused it in just the right way to make your bones question their life choices. Lie on your back, and you felt like a waffle iron's victim. Lie on your side and the metal bunched up under your ribs, forcing you to confront every questionable meal you'd ever eaten. On your stomach. Forget it. That was for people who no longer valued breathing. The padding underneath, the gambeson, was supposed to help. And in fairness, it did, the same way a wet towel helps in a hurricane. It soaked up the sweat that chainmail trapped and added a layer of warm, moist insulation. You didn't sleep so much as slowly steam yourself. If a knight slept long enough, he'd wake up marinated. And don't even think about removing it entirely, because once chainmail came off, it rarely went back on without help. It tangled, folded, and twisted like the world's least cooperative slinky. Most knights lacked the patience for that ordeal, so they just kept it on, half hoping the mail would eventually fuse with their bodies and save them the trouble. Now, you might imagine that over time, one could get used to it. But getting used to chainmail was like getting used to a mosquito bite that lasts 10 years. Chronic bruising, sore joints, and a permanent metallic odour were all part of the package. In fact, chroniclers wrote that the smell of a knight's chainmail was so distinctive you could tell rank by radius. Squires smelled earthy, mercenaries smelled sweaty, and nobles smelled like gold coins slowly oxidising in the sun. The psychological toll wasn't small either. Imagine being surrounded by knights all clinking constantly, 24 hours a day. Even in moments of silence, the faint jingle of steel would haunt your dreams. The ghostly music of men trying to be both deadly and dignified while jingling like wind chimes in a gale. Sometimes, if a knight was lucky enough to camp near a fire, he'd try to warm himself. But fire plus metal armour equals one medieval physics lesson no one wanted. Chainmail held heat beautifully, for about 3 seconds, until it started cooking the wearer alive. More than one weary warrior discovered the difference between toasty and smouldering regret, and yet, despite the discomfort, knights wore chainmail proudly. Because beneath the bruises and the smell, it represented status, protection, wealth, survival. You weren't just a man in metal, you were part of a centuries-old tradition of endurance and poor decision-making. Each clang, each ache, each sleepless night was proof that you belonged to something greater, a fraternity of men too proud to admit that they'd kill for a feather mattress and some fresh linen. So, if you ever feel the urge to romanticize the life of a medieval knight, remember this. Their dreams were forged in iron and interrupted by every move they made. They didn't drift off peacefully to the sound of lutes and nightingales. They dozed off mid-grunt, sweating through their padding, sounding like a tin can filled with angry bees. The moment you remove your helmet, it's like peeling open a portable sauna. The air hits your scalp and the smell hits everyone else. Sweat, oil and hair compressed for 16 hours. A knight's head was basically a slow-cooked onion wrapped in steel. If you've ever worn a motorcycle helmet for an hour and thought, wow, it's getting warm in here, imagine that. But add 40 pounds of metal, a lack of showers and the emotional weight of several unpaid tithes. A medieval helmet wasn't just protection, it was a sensory prison. Inside, the air grew thick and humid, every breath recycling through layers of damp padding. By the end of the day, your skull was less a noble vessel for thoughts, and more a medieval crockpot of regret. Taking it off was both relief and public hazard. Knights who lifted their visors for the first time in hours often described the air as refreshing, while everyone standing nearby described it as a war crime. Because here's the thing, hair hygiene wasn't exactly trending in the 1300s. Shampoo didn't exist. Soap was rare and expensive, so most knights had what can only be described as historically accurate dreadlocks, glued together by equal parts sweat, oil, and sheer willpower. Removing the helmet also came with hazards. The sudden rush of cool air could make a knight dizzy. After hours of compression, blood would surge back to the scalp like a crowd rushing a concert gate. Many knights would stand there, eyes half closed, swaying slightly, as if trying to remember what freedom felt like. A few unlucky ones even fainted, not from battle wounds, but from their own bad ventilation. And oh, the padding. Helmets were lined with cloth or leather to keep the metal from turning your skull into a percussion instrument. Over time, that padding absorbed everything: sweat, rain, dust, the occasional bug, until it became a living organism of its own. Taking off your helmet meant releasing all that trapped aroma in one glorious, horrifying puff. Imagine sticking your head into an old gym bag, leaving it there all day, and then unleashing it upon an unsuspecting village. That's the medieval helmet experience. Of course, knights couldn't just go bald to make things easier. Hair was a sign of vitality and status, a mark of nobility. The longer and shinier, the better. So under that metal dome, their luxurious locks slowly transformed into something resembling cooked noodles left out in the sun. Lice flourished, scalp sores developed, and by bedtime, the average knight's head was both itchy and inflamed enough to qualify as a natural disaster zone. And yet, removing the helmet wasn't entirely optional. Leaving it on too long could lead to heatstroke, dehydration, or just plain insanity. The design of early helmets, especially great helms, had ventilation slits barely wide enough to breathe through. Every inhale came with the taste of metal and yesterday's air. Every exhale fogged the inside like a medieval greenhouse. During long battles, knights were known to lift their visors just for a gasp of fresh air, and occasionally get an arrow straight to the face for their trouble. When the day was done, and the battlefield quieted, removing the helmet became a ritual. You'd unbuckle the chin strap with shaking fingers, tilt the heavy thing forward, and let it fall into your hands like a newborn that hated you. The feeling of cool wind on your face was divine, but fleeting, because the moment you lifted your head, sweat would pour down your temples, your hair would plaster itself to your forehead, and the helmet, now off, would immediately start to smell like reheated despair. And while the knight stood there, helmet in hand, savouring his brief freedom, his squire would appear, wide-eyed, nose wrinkled, holding a rag and praying for strength, because that helmet, no matter how shiny on the outside, was now an ecological hazard. The squire's job was to clean it, re-grease it, and pretend not to notice the ecosystem forming inside. Some even stuffed herbs or dried flowers into the padding, hoping to mask the odour. Lavender, rosemary, mint, all overwhelmed in seconds by the stench of man stew. Sleep didn't bring much relief either. Even after removing the helmet, knights often complained of armour headache, caused by constant weight and pressure on the neck. Their heads throbbed, their ears rang, and their hair, oh, the hair, clung to their faces like damp moss. Many knights described the sensation as having one's skull squeezed by a jealous blacksmith. So next time you watch a medieval movie and see a knight casually pop off his helmet, shake his perfect hair, and smile heroically, remember, in reality that man's head would smell like salted misery. His scalp would be one large rash, and his smile would be a cry for help. If you think knights had it bad, spare a thought for the squires. These poor teens spent their nights polishing armour, cleaning mud, and trying to avoid eye contact, while their lord snored like a dying dragon. Their reward? The privilege of doing it all again tomorrow. Being a squire wasn't glamorous. It was the medieval equivalent of being an unpaid intern, except instead of fetching coffee, you fetched swords, brushed horses, and scrubbed out the inside of a helmet that smelled like fermented regret. Most squires were around 14 to 16 years old, barely old enough to grow a moustache, yet already old enough to know the exact texture of their master's foot fungus. It was the ultimate lesson in humility, or maybe just endurance. At dawn, while the knight was still drooling into his pillow of horsehair and hubris, the squire was already up, trudging through mud with a bucket of water so icy it could qualify as a weapon. He'd wash the armour piece by piece, scrubbing off dried blood, rust, and the occasional bit of battlefield mystery goo. The knight, meanwhile, would yawn and ask, "Is breakfast ready yet?" as if the squire hadn't been awake since before the rooster even had his coffee. And that armour, was both a curse and a full-time job. Every link, strap and buckle needed oiling, every dent needed hammering, every bit of chainmail needed shaking free of whatever the knight had collected that day. Mud, straw, grass, the occasional frog. If it stuck, the squire had to remove it. A good polish could take hours, A bad polish could earn you a lecture about discipline from a man who hadn't bathed since last Lent. Squires were also human luggage handlers. If the knight went riding, the squire followed, carrying supplies, weapons, and whatever emotional baggage his master didn't have time for. When battle came, squires didn't fight on the front lines. They were in the back, waiting with spare lances, praying their knight didn't get himself killed before lunch. And if he did fall, the squire's job was to drag his armoured body, roughly 200 pounds of honour and responsibility, out of the mud before the looters got to him. At night, when the fighting stopped, and everyone stumbled back to camp, the squire's work didn't end. While the knights boasted around the fire about who struck whom and how gloriously, the squires tended to the horses, patched torn gambesons, and laid out the gear for the next miserable dawn. Their hands were permanently blistered, their backs perpetually sore, and their eyes filled with the 1,000-yard stare of someone who's been yelled at for polishing in the wrong direction. And yet, there was pride in it. Strange, stubborn pride. Because for many, being a squire was the first step toward knighthood. It was the long, muddy road from servant to soldier, from polishing steel to wearing it. Every bruise was a lesson. Every shout from a knight was a preview of the shouting they'd one day do themselves. It was the medieval circle of life, but with more chainmail and less singing. Still, it was a brutal education. A squire learned everything from tending wounds to reading heraldry, to not crying when a horse kicked you. They practiced swordsmanship, archery, and how to dodge flying mutton bones at feasts. They memorised prayers, battle tactics, and the delicate art of pretending not to notice when their knight drunkenly fell into a moat. And for all that, they received food scraps, a blanket if lucky, and the occasional "good job, boy" mumbled through a mouthful of ale. Their true payment was experience, and the faint hope that one day they'd have a squire of their own to torment lovingly. Of course, not every squire made it to knighthood. Some quit, some died, and some realised that polishing armour for a living was still better than actually wearing it into battle. But those who endured, those who rose before dawn, scrubbed until their fingers bled, and never once complained, out loud, they became the backbone of medieval chivalry. The unsung heroes beneath the heroes. So while history remembers the shining knights, it forgets the tired teenagers standing just behind them, smelling faintly of oil, sweat, and crushed dreams, making it all possible. Because behind every noble knight who slept in his armour, there was a squire, awake in the dark, wondering why no one ever writes songs about the guy who did all the work. Luxury was for kings. A knight's pillow was usually a rolled-up cloak, a saddlebag, or sometimes, if they were truly lucky, a folded tunic that still smelled faintly of victory and strong regret. Feather-stuffed comfort. Try horse leather and damp wool. In the Middle Ages, the idea of comfort was more theoretical than real. While nobles in castles might have down-stuffed pillows embroidered with gold thread, knights on campaign learned to appreciate whatever object could prop their heads above the mud. After 12 hours of battle, armour chafing and soul broken, the only requirement for a pillow was not wet, a standard rarely met. The cloak was the go-to choice, a loyal, multi-purpose piece of fabric that had seen too much. By day it kept off rain, by night it transformed into a lumpy headrest with all the softness of a frozen ham. The more seasoned knights learned to fold it strategically, double it at the edges, roll it under the neck and ignore the smell of horse sweat. It wasn't exactly luxury bedding, but it beat resting your skull on a rock shaped like disappointment. If the cloak was missing, the saddlebag was next in line. Nothing says noble slumber like using your horse's luggage as a pillow. The contents were questionable. Half-eaten bread, a whetstone, maybe a spare sock, and that saddle leather smell. Oh, it lingered. A mix of animal fat, oil, and something faintly resembling regret. But at least it had structure. Unlike the ground, which had a cruel sense of humour, and always hid a sharp pebble directly under your temple. Some particularly unfortunate knights had no bag, no cloak, and no tunic to spare. These brave souls resorted to the earth itself, a mound of dirt or a patch of moss if available. The moss, romanticised by poets as soft and green, was usually damp, cold, and home to several opinionated beetles. Still, beggars couldn't be choosers. As one medieval chronicler never said but probably thought, "He who sleeps on moss learns quickly the meaning of humility." Of course, there was always that one knight who bragged about his pillow innovation. Maybe he stuffed grass into a spare cloth or used his shield as a headrest. These experiments rarely ended well. Grass flattened instantly, and shields were cold, concave, and resonated with every snore, effectively turning the night into a living drum. Nothing says, "good night's sleep," like vibrating metal echoing your every breath. The lack of a real pillow had side effects too. Chronic neck pain was practically part of knighthood. A campaign could last weeks, and by the end of it, most knights walked like badly carved statues, shoulders hunched, heads tilted, as if perpetually trying to find the least painful angle for existing. Their spines told stories of every night spent pretending a saddlebag was ergonomic, and yet knights carried on. Because complaining wasn't considered honourable. You could whine about your sword being dull or your squire being lazy, but the moment you admitted your neck hurt from your pillow, you'd never hear the end of it. Chivalry demanded stoicism, and stoicism demanded pretending your spine wasn't disintegrating. Sometimes, when luck smiled and a knight camped near a manor or monastery, he might be granted a bed. A real bed. Straw mattress, linen sheets, maybe even a small cushion stuffed with wool. The experience was so transcendent it bordered on religious. Imagine weeks of sleeping in dirt, then suddenly sinking into softness. It must have felt like being embraced by heaven, if heaven smelled faintly of mould and candle smoke. But for most, that luxury never came. Their nightly routine remained simple. Remove the helmet, loosen the straps, collapse, and shove something vaguely pillow-shaped under their heads. The goal wasn't rest, it was survival. And maybe, if they were lucky, a dream that didn't involve lice. And so, while poets wrote about knights dreaming of glory, the truth was less majestic. Most knights didn't dream at all, not because they lacked imagination, but because their necks hurt too much to fall asleep properly. So tonight, when you lay your head on a memory foam pillow and sigh into the luxury of modern life, take a moment to appreciate that your bedtime doesn't involve horse sweat, damp wool, or a leather bag filled with turnips. Because in the age of knights, even rest came with armour, and even dreams needed padding. Now imagine 50 armoured men in a tent all snoring in unison. The sound isn't human, it's metallic, monstrous, and rhythmic, like a blacksmith hammering an anvil underwater. And if you weren't asleep yet, congratulations, neither was anyone else. The medieval knight's campsite wasn't a peaceful place. Forget the romantic notion of moonlight glinting on polished steel and the distant hoot of an owl. No, the average military encampment sounded like a herd of rhinoceroses with sinus problems trapped inside a cathedral. The mixture of chainmail rustling, armour creaking, and 50 exhausted men trying to breathe through battle-damaged noses created what historians now refer to as an absolute nightmare. Snoring wasn't just common, it was legendary. Years of breathing smoke, sleeping in damp conditions, and getting repeatedly punched in the face during training left most knights with nasal passages that could whistle, wheeze, and honk like an orchestra of medieval geese. The heavy drinking didn't help either. After a long day of swinging swords and shouting for glory, nothing hit quite like several pints of warm ale, the medieval version of NyQuil mixed with regret. Once the snoring began, it spread like a plague. One night started with a soft rumble, barely audible. Then another joined, deeper, more guttural. Before long, the whole tent transformed into a metallic symphony of sleep-deprived suffering. The rhythms didn't even line up. Some nights snored in gasps, others in long, sustained growls. It was less a lullaby and more an ongoing argument between chainsaws. Now add the armour. Many nights slept partially suited, meaning every twitch, every roll, every accidental kick set off a cascade of metallic clanks. Picture trying to rest in a pile of saucepans while your bunkmate wrestles a ghost in his dreams. The acoustics of a canvas tent didn't help. Every sound bounced, echoed and magnified until even the rats fled in terror. And yes, rats. Because no medieval night was complete without a few furry intruders darting between bedrolls, feasting on breadcrumbs and existential dread. Some knights tried to scare them off with shouts or sword taps, but mostly the rodents just learned to move in rhythm with the snores. Nature's first percussion section. The smell didn't make things easier. Between the sweat, unwashed linen, damp wool, and that faint tang of iron and horse, the air grew so thick you could practically chew it. Combine that with the noise, and sleep became less a restful act and more a psychological endurance test. The truly desperate would try to drown out the snoring with their cloaks pulled over their heads, only to suffocate slowly inside their own portable stink chamber. Occasionally, the snoring reached such intensity that nearby soldiers thought a bear had wandered into camp. Chroniclers tell tales, possibly exaggerated, possibly not, of tents shaking from the vibrations. One French knight allegedly snored so loudly that his horse refused to sleep near him, forcing the poor animal to relocate to a nearby bush in protest. And then, the interruptions. Just when you were about to drift off, finally, mercifully, someone would roll over in armour, setting off a crash like thunder. Or a knight would jolt awake mid-dream, shouting "for the king," while accidentally punching his squire in the face. Silence was rare, fleeting, and usually broken by someone breaking wind with the force of a trumpet. In the morning, nobody admitted to snoring. Each knight blamed the others, swearing he was silent as a saint. But the truth was in their eyes. Dark circles, red veins, the hollow look of men who'd heard their own mortality whistling through nasal passages all night. Some squires tried to help by stuffing bits of cloth or wax into their ears. It didn't work. The sound travelled through the ground, through the armour, through their very souls. One could almost say the snoring became part of the medieval landscape, as constant as rain, mud, and regret. So when people today complain about their partner's snoring, remember, at least your bedroom isn't filled with 50 chainmail-clad men wheezing like asthmatic dragons. There's no echoing clang of metal, no chorus of sleep-deprived knights muttering prayers between snores. Because back then, the real battle wasn't fought with swords or lances. It was fought every night, in the darkness of the tent. A desperate, unending war between man, metal, and the simple dream of one peaceful night's sleep. Bathing was considered optional, or worse, sinful. So by bedtime, the combined stench of 50 knights, a dozen horses, and one unlucky pig created an atmosphere thick enough to chew. You didn't breathe the air breathed you. In medieval Europe, the concept of clean was more spiritual than physical. Dirt was seen as divine camouflage, a layer of humble earth between the body and temptation. To bathe too often was to flirt with vanity. So knights, sworn to piety and war, proudly wore their grime like a badge of faith. And by the end of the day, that badge could knock a buzzard off its perch. Picture it. A tent full of armoured men who've been riding since sunrise, sweating beneath steel under a sun that didn't know mercy. The air inside thickens into something living, a hybrid of horse sweat, wet leather, unwashed fabric, and the unique bouquet of man who hasn't met soap since Easter. Even the flies can't decide where under the armour lurked the true enemy, fleas, tiny, relentless, armour-piercing agents of chaos. A knight might survive an ambush, but not the endless scratching that came with sleeping in sweat-soaked padding. Fleas were the great equaliser of medieval society. Kings, knights, peasants, it didn't matter. If you had a pulse and a warm patch of fabric, you were fair game. And knights, wrapped in layers of quilted gambeson, linen, and chainmail, were essentially Michelin star buffets for the insect kingdom. A knight's armour was supposed to protect him from blades, but it might as well have been a 5-star resort for anything with 6 legs. By nightfall, the battlefield wasn't their biggest problem. It was the buzzing, biting, crawling symphony inside their clothes. They'd toss and turn on their lumpy bedrolls, scratching through layers of armour and fabric, groaning like cursed maracas. You could almost tell the rank of a knight by the speed and volume of his nighttime itching. Veterans didn't scream anymore. They just sighed, a deep broken sound that said, "Yes, this is my life now." No amount of scratching helped, because the fleas weren't just on you. They were in everything. Your clothes, your bedroll, your boots, your hair. They even made themselves at home in the seams of your sword belt. And the worst part? You couldn't strip off and wash. Water was for drinking, and bathing was for rich lunatics who didn't mind catching pneumonia. Knights tried everything to fight back. They smoked their tents with herbs, rubbed garlic on their skin, sprinkled ashes into their bedding. None of it worked. One desperate French knight reportedly burned his gambeson to kill the fleas, only to realise too late that it was his only gambeson. The fleas survived. The gambeson didn't. By the Crusades, the problem had gone global. Pilgrims and warriors brought their flea armies across continents. Fleas didn't just follow them, they thrived on them, spreading diseases like the medieval version of bad Yelp reviews. Some chroniclers even joked that the real victors of the Crusades were the bugs, and honestly they weren't wrong. So, when dawn broke, and the knights groggily rose from another sleepless night, they scratched their necks, tightened their belts, and marched on. Not for glory, not for honour, but for a brief distraction from the unending itch of existence. Because no matter how strong or noble you were, every knight eventually learned one universal truth. No armour can defend against fleas. Forget silk pavilions. Most tents were damp, sagging contraptions smelling of mildew and horse. The fabric leaked, the ropes creaked, and if the wind blew hard enough, you woke up spooning your own shield in a puddle. Despite what medieval paintings would have you believe, most knights didn't sleep beneath grand, colourful banners. Those were for tournaments or kings trying to impress each other. Out in the field, tents were hastily assembled nightmares, patched together from rough canvas, hide, and the occasional stolen curtain. Setting them up was a group activity requiring equal parts teamwork, prayer, and swearing. Once built, the tent quickly became a humid prison. The fabric absorbed rain, held in heat, and trapped every smell from man and beast alike. It was less portable home and more sweaty coffin. The air inside was heavy, a mix of wet wool, leather oil, and despair. And since tents were often shared by several knights, privacy wasn't even a concept. You changed, slept, and complained all within arm's reach of 3 other snoring men who smelled just like you. When it rained, which was often, the water didn't politely stay outside. It dripped through seams, ran down the poles, and pooled along the edges, where it mixed with dirt and horse droppings. You could always tell the new recruits. They'd put their bedding near the tent wall and wake up in a medieval swimming pool. Veterans knew to sleep in the middle, clutching their swords, praying the ropes held through the night. Wind was another enemy. A good gust could turn your tent into a parachute with you still inside. Many chronicles mention knights waking up halfway across the field, wrapped in canvas like burritos of confusion. And in winter, the tent didn't keep warmth in so much as politely remind you what warmth used to feel like. Then came the wildlife. Spiders, mice, and beetles made themselves right at home. Some horses even poked their heads through the flaps, chewing on stray cloaks while the knights shouted half-heartedly in protest. After a few nights, most men gave up trying to fight it. The tent wasn't just a shelter, it was a test of character. If you could sleep there, you could sleep anywhere. Yet for all its misery, the tent was a knight's refuge. Outside was war, mud, and danger. Inside was mud, danger, and slightly less war. It was where they told stories, shared flasks of wine, and laughed about the absurdity of it all. The leaks, the fleas, the cold, they became part of the rhythm of life. Complaining was expected, almost comforting. Because in the end, the tent wasn't just a piece of canvas, it was a symbol of endurance, a reminder that even in the worst conditions, people could still find a way to sit in the dark, smell terrible, and somehow call it camping. There's something deeply poetic about a knight lying awake in a thunderstorm, wondering if lightning respects chivalry. Spoiler, it doesn't. Medieval science was shaky, but even knights knew metal and lightning were not best friends. Picture this. It's 2 a.m. The rain is hammering against your sagging canvas tent like an army of tiny, angry blacksmiths, and you, a tired knight, are lying there wrapped in 60 pounds of conductive regret. The wind howls, thunder shakes the ground, and somewhere outside your horse is making that panicked whinny that sounds like, "We're all going to die." You pull your cloak tighter, whisper a prayer to Saint whoever handles lightning, and try to convince yourself that metal armour probably doesn't really attract electricity, right? Well, not exactly. Medieval people didn't understand electricity the way we do, but they did understand fear. The sight of a thunderstorm rolling over the camp was enough to make even the bravest knights feel like crispy dinner waiting to happen. Armour might have protected you from arrows and swords, but against the sky's divine temper tantrum it basically turned you into a walking lightning rod with anxiety issues. Some chroniclers claim knights would actually remove their helmets and breastplates when lightning struck nearby, preferring to risk an ambush over spontaneous combustion. Others were too exhausted or too wet to care. They just lay there, muttering, "If God wants me, he can have me," and rolled over, creating a small splash in their personal puddle of misery. And the tents. They offered about as much protection as a paper napkin. Medieval tents leaked like the plot of a bad soap opera. Water dripped through every seam, soaking the ground until your bedroll became a sponge of despair. The more elite knights, those with silk-lined tents, weren't much better off. Silk might have looked fancy, but it turned transparent when wet, leaving even the most dignified noble looking like a shiny, terrified caterpillar waiting for the afterlife. Lightning strikes in camp were rare but memorable. Horses would panic, men would shout prayers in 50 different dialects, and someone, always someone, would yell, "We're cursed," before tripping over a shield and falling into the mud. The lucky ones laughed it off afterward, though usually while counting how many of their possessions had floated away in the downpour. Now, the noise. Oh, the noise. Imagine the thunder crashing directly above you, echoing off your armour, vibrating through your bones. Every boom sounded like the sky was swinging a hammer at your soul. Some knights described it as thrilling. Others described it as the moment they reconsidered all their life choices, including joining the Crusades and eating that questionable stew earlier. For those on guard duty, the storm was even worse. Standing outside in metal armour during a lightning storm was basically medieval Russian roulette. Every flash lit up the field, transforming the landscape into a nightmare painting. Gleaming wet armour, ghostly banners flapping in the wind, and silhouettes of knights squinting up at the sky, hoping divine wrath took the guy next to them instead. Sometimes, after the storm passed, the camp was unrecognisable. Mud-swallowed boots, tents sagged into shapeless lumps, and everything smelled faintly of wet wool and disappointment. Armour that hadn't been properly oiled would rust overnight, turning a nobleman's shining chestplate into a patchy orange tragedy. The next morning was a chorus of groans, curses, and one squire whispering, "I told you to take it off, my lord." But even amid the chaos there was a strange sort of beauty. The rain glistened on swords, lightning danced across helmets, and somewhere in the distance monks probably wrote about how it symbolised God's purification of man's pride. The knights, however, knew better. It wasn't divine poetry. It was wet socks, ruined armour, and a very real fear that your next sneeze might be your last. By sunrise, when the storm finally broke and the clouds gave way to weak, apologetic sunlight, the camp looked like a medieval shipwreck. Knights stumbled out, drenched and steaming, trying to wring out their cloaks and dignity. Horses snorted, squires coughed, and someone inevitably shouted, "Who took my boots?" And yet, as miserable as it was, they endured it, because what else could they do? The storm didn't care about rank or valour. It didn't care if your armour was gold-plated or borrowed. It treated everyone equally, as conductors. So, when you picture those heroic knights shining in the rain, remember, half of them were praying not to be struck by lightning, the other half were wondering if they'd ever dry out, and all of them were just one thunderclap away from admitting that maybe, just maybe, metal pyjamas weren't the brightest idea humanity ever had. Back sleeping? Impossible. Side sleeping? Risky. Belly sleeping? Fatal. Armour didn't bend. You did. Every position came with new regrets, and by dawn, your body resembled a sculpture of agony made entirely of cramps. There was no such thing as a comfortable sleeping position for a medieval knight. The human body wasn't designed to fold neatly inside a tin can, but that didn't stop knights from trying. Every night was a new experiment in pain management and creativity. Maybe if I wedge the sword hilt under my shoulder I can tilt my spine just enough to breathe, thought one optimist, moments before realising he'd invented a new kind of back injury. Sleeping in armour was like trying to nap inside a filing cabinet. The steel plates pressed against joints, the mail dug into skin, and every movement produced a chorus of squeaks, clanks, and quiet cursing. The gambeson beneath the armour, that thick quilted layer meant to soften blows, only made things worse. It absorbed sweat like a sponge and clung to the skin with the affection of a desperate ex. On your back, the weight of the armour crushed your shoulders and made every breath sound like a dying accordion. On your side, the edge of your breastplate dug into your ribs, and the chainmail pinched places you didn't know existed. And on your stomach, well, that's how you found out what your lungs really couldn't handle. Knights often tried to find creative workarounds, some stacked saddlebags or shields under their heads to prop themselves up, hoping gravity would relieve the pressure. Others used their cloaks as makeshift padding, though that usually ended with the cloak sliding away, leaving them face down in dirt and regret. A few brave souls simply fell asleep sitting up, legs crossed, sword across their lap, head bobbing like a drowsy pigeon. And then there was the armour gap dilemma, that thin strip of exposed flesh where your plates didn't quite meet. It was the Bermuda Triangle of discomfort. Every rock, every root, every lump of uneven ground seemed magnetically drawn to that exact spot. If you rolled, it followed. If you didn't roll, it grew. By midnight you'd swear the earth itself was conspiring against your spine. Even the act of trying to sleep was exhausting. First, you'd unstrap the gauntlets, loosen the belt, maybe even lift your helmet just enough to scratch that unreachable itch on your temple. Then you'd settle down, listening to the symphony of snoring, farting and armour creaking around you. Just when your eyelids started to droop, clang! Someone rolled over and accidentally knocked their sword against their shield. You'd jolt awake, heart pounding, because in a knight's world, every sound could mean battle. Or Roger dropped his helmet again. By dawn, no one had really slept. You'd wake up not because you were rested, but because you were done. Your back screamed, your neck protested, and your joints sounded like they were trying to communicate in Morse code. You'd stretch, hearing half your armour pop and groan like an old door hinge, and tell yourself, "I've slept worse." You hadn't, and yet knights kept doing it. Night after night, campaign after campaign, they willingly returned to the same iron embrace. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was survival instinct. Better to wake up sore than wake up stabbed. Or maybe it was just the medieval version of toxic masculinity. Real men don't need featherbeds. Real men need vertebral misalignment. When historians write about chivalry, they usually skip over this part. The part where brave warriors spent their nights silently screaming into their chainmail pillows, bargaining with God for just one comfortable position. Because for all their valour, all their courage, and all their shiny armour, knights shared one universal truth with the rest of humanity. Nobody, no matter how noble, sleeps well when their bed fights back. So next time you shift in your cosy bed and fluff your pillow, spare a thought for those poor souls in the 13th century, contorted like pretzels under 60 pounds of metal, whispering into the dark, "Tomorrow I'll try sleeping on the other side." They never did. Because there was no other side. There was only pain, and the faint delusional hope that maybe, just maybe, chivalry would come with a chiropractor. Even if you wanted to sleep, chances are it wasn't your turn. Knights took shifts watching the camp, standing in the cold while pretending not to hallucinate wolves that turned out to be damp cloaks. The night watch was every knight's least favourite duty, a grim combination of boredom, paranoia and frostbite. You just spent the day marching through mud, swinging a sword and questioning every decision that led you here. Then, as the camp settled into its symphony of snores and flatulence, someone would shake your shoulder and say the 4 most dreaded words in the medieval vocabulary. "It's your turn, my lord." You'd stumble out of your tent, armour half on, breath misting in the freezing air. The moon would hang there like a bored overseer, watching as you shuffled toward your post. Around you shadows stretched and shifted. Every bush looked like an ambush, every creaking branch like the prelude to a raid. You'd grip your sword tighter, which did absolutely nothing to keep your hands from going numb. There were no torches for comfort. Too risky, too visible. Just the flicker of distant campfires barely illuminating the outlines of tents, and the occasional terrified squire scurrying back to bed. The sounds of the night became your companions. The snort of horses, the rustle of canvas, the slow crackle of embers. And then, inevitably, something far less comforting. A snap, a shuffle, the unmistakable crunch of leaves. You'd squint into the darkness, trying to decide whether it was an enemy scout or just a hedgehog living its best life. Knights liked to pretend they were fearless, but the truth was the human imagination is far more terrifying than any real danger. Hours of silence in the dark could make even the bravest soul see things that weren't there. You'd start off alert, back straight, eyes scanning the horizon like a hero in a painting. But after 20 minutes, your eyelids grew heavy. After an hour, your thoughts got weird. After 2 hours, you were whispering to your sword for company and trying to convince yourself that the wind didn't just whisper your name. Fatigue turned the world surreal. The distant rustle of horses sounded like whispers. The flapping of a tent became the moan of a ghostly choir. More than one knight reportedly fell asleep standing up, balanced like a tin scarecrow until they tipped over with a clatter that woke the entire camp. And when that happened, oh, the shame. No amount of honour could erase the humiliation of being the knight who face-planted during watch. The weather, of course, made everything worse. Winter nights turned armour into ice sculptures. You could practically hear your joints freezing in real time. Every exhale puffed into a cloud that instantly drifted away, taking your will to live with it. Summer wasn't better. Instead of freezing, you got eaten alive by mosquitoes the size of small birds. Either way, you couldn't win. Then there was the boredom. The endless, mind-numbing boredom. You couldn't sing, you couldn't hum, and you definitely couldn't sit down, because if your commander found you napping, you'd be scrubbing latrines until Christmas. So you stood there, trying to look heroic while your brain slowly leaked out through your ears. Some nights tried counting stars, others counted regrets. Most just stared into the darkness, mentally composing angry letters to whatever saint was supposed to protect soldiers. The irony? If something did happen, if bandits attacked, or if an enemy scout crept too close, half the camp would be too groggy to respond anyway. The night watch's job wasn't really to stop danger. It was to notice danger just long enough to scream "alarm" before being trampled by half-awake men running in the wrong direction. By dawn, when your shift finally ended, you'd drag yourself back to your tent, half frozen, half delirious, and fully convinced that you'd heard the devil himself out there. You'd collapse onto your damp bedroll just as the trumpets sounded for morning drills, and that was the true cruelty of it all. You didn't even get to sleep afterward. The night watch wasn't just about vigilance, it was about endurance, the kind that didn't earn you glory or songs, just back pain and a 1,000-yard stare. It was a quiet kind of suffering, shared by every knight who ever stood guard and wondered if they'd survive till sunrise. Because the battlefield was dangerous, yes, but the battlefield was loud. The night watch was worse. It was silence, imagination, and the slow, creeping realization that the scariest thing in the dark might just be your own thoughts. When morning came, there was no coffee, no eggs, just stale bread and sour wine. The breakfast of champions who desperately wanted to die. If you dropped your bread in the mud, well, it was now seasoned. Dawn in a medieval camp wasn't so much a peaceful sunrise as it was a mass awakening of hungover misery. The first light slipped through the fog, revealing a battlefield of groggy knights, wheezing horses and squires who looked like they hadn't slept since the last full moon. The air smelled like wet leather, smoke, and existential regret. The camp cook, if you were lucky enough to have one, was already standing over a fire pit stirring something that looked like porridge but behaved like cement. Breakfast was a generous term. What you got depended on your rank, your luck, and how many rats had visited your supply wagon during the night. Most mornings began with a hunk of bread so hard it could double as a weapon. The trick was to soak it in wine, which wasn't for pleasure, it was purely practical. The alcohol softened the bread and conveniently dulled the memory of everything else. If you were a particularly lucky night, maybe you got a slice of salted pork or a lump of cheese that had achieved sentience, but most just gnawed at their bread in silence, pretending it was something better. Every bite came with a small crunch of sand or dirt, because in a world where you slept in mud and fought in mud, you also ate mud. It was, quite literally, part of the experience. And that wine, don't imagine a smooth red vintage swirling in a goblet. This was rough, vinegary, made by a guy named Henry in a barrel wine. It burned going down and occasionally came back up. But it was safer than water, which was usually filled with more diseases than a medieval love story. So, you drank, winced, and told yourself you felt invigorated, even though you were mostly dehydrated and slightly poisoned. Some nights tried to liven things up. They mixed their bread and wine together into a mushy concoction, affectionately known as a sop. Others warmed their rations over the fire until the smoke gave it that burnt but edible quality. Occasionally, a lucky patrol would bring back something fresh. Maybe a rabbit, maybe a fish, maybe something that used to be a rabbit or fish. It all went into the same pot, seasoned with whatever herbs could be found and a shared sense of despair. Breakfast conversation wasn't exactly lively. Most men sat hunched over, groaning about their armour, their wounds, and the lack of caffeine. Though of course no one knew what caffeine was, they just knew mornings hurt. Someone would inevitably ask what the day's plan was, and someone else would say, "Don't die," followed by polite tired laughter. The squires fared even worse. Their meal often consisted of crumbs scavenged from their lord's leftovers and whatever they could scrape from the bottom of a pot. Yet they carried on, because if they didn't, they'd get a lecture about discipline from someone who hadn't bathed since the last crusade. And then there were the smells. Oh, the smells. Wet wool, stale wine, horse sweat, human sweat, and the faint nostalgic scent of yesterday's campfire smoke. It mixed into a heady perfume that would make modern cologne companies file lawsuits against the concept of air. Some knights tried to mask it with herbs or flower petals tucked into their armour. This just made them smell like sweaty gardens. But despite all that, the bad food, the worse smells, the constant ache, there was a strange camaraderie in these breakfasts. Laughter would break out here and there, usually at someone's expense. Someone would tell a joke about the cook's stew having more bark than beef, or mock the guy who accidentally slept on his sword. Misery, shared over a pot of gruel, became almost bearable. As the sun rose higher, the camp slowly came to life. Horses neighed, squires packed gear, and knights tightened their belts, pretending they hadn't just eaten something that tasted like despair. Helmets went back on, weapons were checked, and the quiet dread of battle replaced the sleepy dread of morning, because that was the reality of the medieval breakfast. It wasn't meant to delight or satisfy. It was meant to get you through the next few hours of chaos without fainting. You didn't eat to enjoy it, you ate to survive, and if the bread didn't crack your teeth and the wine didn't melt your stomach lining, that was considered a good start to the day. So the next time you sit down to a warm croissant and a latte, remember, somewhere out there, your medieval ancestors were gnawing on rock-hard bread, sipping vinegar and muttering, "Ah yes, another glorious morning." Then they'd march off to battle, slightly hungover, entirely miserable, and probably still hungry. Taking off armour was risky. It made you vulnerable, but keeping it on made you smell like boiled night casserole. Every evening was a gamble between comfort and survival, or at least what medieval people called comfort. The daily to remove or not to remove debate was one of the most harrowing moral dilemmas of knighthood. After a day of swinging swords, trudging through mud, and absorbing the collective heat of a small forge, the only thing a knight wanted was to peel that metal shell off and feel something resembling airflow. But then came the dark reminder. The moment you unbuckle that chest plate, you were one enemy raid away from being the world's easiest piñata. Knights had to make a choice every night. Stay armoured and sweat yourself into oblivion, or strip down and risk being stabbed before you could say, "Give me a second, I'm finding the clasp." And make no mistake, medieval armour was not built for quick changes. It wasn't like taking off a jacket, it was like dismantling a car while wearing the car. Each piece had to be unlaced, unbuckled, or unscrewed by hand, usually by a squire who looked 2 moments away from quitting and becoming a monk. The full process could take 15 to 20 minutes, longer if you were exhausted, or if your squire was too busy pretending not to notice your body odour. Some knights tried shortcuts, loosening straps, removing only their gauntlets, or sleeping half-armoured. But that often led to the morning problem, where they'd wake up with metal pieces stuck in places armour was never meant to touch. On the other hand, sleeping without armour wasn't exactly the spa experience it sounds like. Your body was raw from friction burns, your gambeson was damp from sweat, and your shirt, if you even had one left, clung to you like a soggy moral lesson. Removing the armour released every trapped scent of the day. Horse, sweat, iron, and fear. It filled the tent like a curse that couldn't be unsmelled, and if there was even a rumour of an attack, panic spread fast. Knights scrambled half-dressed through camp trying to find their breastplates in the dark. There are records of men putting their armour on backward in the chaos, which, to be fair, probably confused their enemies long enough to help them survive. The noise alone was deafening. The clanking of metal, the shouting of orders, and somewhere, a squire crying softly because he dropped his lord's helmet in the mud again. Still, some knights took the gamble nightly. They'd remove their armour piece by piece, sighing in relief as cool air hit their skin, blissfully ignoring the smell that could fell a horse. That first deep breath of freedom was pure medieval ecstasy. You could almost hear their souls unclenching. But it never lasted. Within an hour, the damp cold crept in, the bugs arrived, and reality came knocking or biting. Meanwhile, the cautious types, the ones who slept armoured, liked to boast in the morning about how they'd survived the night. What they didn't mention was that they'd also survived 0 sleep, 3 cramps, and a new rash that could probably qualify as its own species. They'd groan when they stood up, joints cracking like kindling, faces pale from dehydration and bad decisions. Armour maintenance also became part of the gamble. Remove it too often, and it rusted faster. Keep it on, and the sweat would do the same thing, only from the inside. Medieval rust wasn't just inconvenient, it was a death sentence for equipment that already cost more than a small village. So every morning, squires spent hours scraping, oiling, and pretending not to gag. And then there were the bugs. Fleas, lice, and other enterprising creatures loved the warmth of a night's underlayers. Removing your armour didn't just mean freedom, it meant discovering a new ecosystem thriving on your chest. Some men reportedly slept with small fires burning nearby, not for warmth, but to smoke the pests out. It worked about as well as you'd imagine. So each night, as the camp quieted and rain drummed on the tents, knights faced the same cruel question. Risk comfort or risk death? Most compromised. A boot off here, a shoulder plate loosened there, a delicate dance of half relief, half paranoia. They'd drift to sleep, armour creaking, ready to wake at the first shout of alarm. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't noble, it was, quite literally, survival wrapped in iron. And as they lay there, sweat-soaked, exhausted, and praying the enemy didn't fancy a midnight raid, one thought united every night across the centuries. I should have just become a blacksmith. So tonight, as you sink deeper into your soft mattress, your sheets clean, your room quiet, your air faintly scented with fabric softener instead of the horse, take a deep breath and be thankful you weren't born in the age of rust and regret. Because as we've just learned, medieval comfort was a philosophical concept, not a physical experience. The knights of old endured a world that was loud, cold, and constantly itchy. They slept in puddles, dreamed in armour, and woke up to the scent of 50 unwashed comrades and 1 confused pig. They fought not only battles for kings and kingdoms, but also nightly wars against gravity, weather, and their own chainmail. And somehow, impossibly, they got up every morning and did it again. It's funny, really. For all their misery, those knights were masters of endurance. Their resilience wasn't glamorous, it was stubborn, sweaty, and deeply human. They carried on through the exhaustion, the discomfort, and the absurdity, not because it was easy, but because it was life. And maybe that's the quiet lesson buried under all the clanking armour and fleas. Humanity has always adapted. We grumble, we suffer, we find the humour in it, and then, somehow, we keep going. So as you drift off tonight, tucked safely under your blanket that isn't damp, in a bed that isn't dirt, whisper a quiet thank you to every soul who came before you, the ones who scratched through sleepless nights so you could enjoy this one in peace. Because history may be uncomfortable, but it's also proof that we survive. And now, thankfully, we get to do it with memory foam. Good night, traveller, sleep easy, and dream armour free.